like to introduce Dr. Nicola Bradbear. First of all, I'd like to thank the C.V. Dennis Trust for their sponsorship for this talk. Really, I welcome you, Nicola. I'm looking forward very much to hearing about your work, particularly as you're centering on Africa. So thank you. I'm handing over to you. Thank you very much.
Hello there. Thank you for joining this session this afternoon, and thank you to the BBKA Spring Convention for inviting me, and to the C.B. Dennis British Beekeepers Research Trust who are sponsoring this afternoon's session. So my name is Nicola Bradbear, and I run the organisation Bees for Development here in Monmouth, and I'm also part of Apomondia, which is the World Federation of Beekeepers Associations, and within Apomondia I'm responsible for the Commission Beekeeping for Rural Development. So this afternoon I'm going to talk about research in beekeeping development and some of the research needs that still exist. Just to tell you a little bit more about Bees for Development, we're based here in Monmouth in South Wales, but just on the border with England. And last year we were very pleased because Monmouth was kind of renamed Monmouth Bee Town, because here in Monmouth there's lots of bee related activities going on, and of course it's where we're based. So do come and visit us if you're ever in this part of the world. We are next door to the biggest pub in Monmouth, the King's Head. That's us, the green fronted building, and I'm sitting there talking to you now. And at the front of our offices we have a shop, and revenue from the shop contributes to supporting our work with beekeepers in developing countries. So since we began work in 1993, we've had the same dual aims: to alleviate poverty by means of beekeeping, and of course the marvellous thing is at the same time to give people incentive to maintain and even improve biodiversity. And that's why beekeeping is so wonderful, really, because you give people a worthwhile income source and at the same time they contribute to pollination. You are all beekeepers, I guess, or would-be beekeepers, so you know very well already the great value of pollination, that really honey and beeswax are just kind of bonus crops that incentivize us to care for bees, but that's a good thing. And in these days of COVID and so on, I think we see even more the need for employment, rural employment opportunities for people to make a livelihood at home, and beekeeping is coming even more into its own incredible value as a source of rural livelihood, and not just in poor countries. It's a wonderful employment opportunity and also a wonderful hobby, and it's fantastic that we're seeing a resurgence in interest in beekeeping these days. And that resurgence is here in the UK, but it's also in developing countries, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more this afternoon. So Bees for Development, we've been working since 1993 all around the world on many projects in different nations, and beekeeping is not the same everywhere, and bees are not the same everywhere, but wherever we work, we're working with beekeepers using their own local skills, and it's kind of the same everywhere. The people that live there, the beekeepers that live there, knows the bees that are there and have good skills with those bees. So it's always about using local bees, local skills, local materials to make equipment, and all equipment has to be made locally. Projects never work when they depend on stuff from outside, so we don't get involved in that at all. It's always about using what is there already, and best of all if it's there free of charge already. So there we are. These are some girls in northern Ethiopia learning to make top bar hives, and everything that they're making those hives from is freely available. And very often in our projects, our focus of our work is often on access to good markets. It's on the trade side of marketing the produce, so that beekeeping really helps people to move on from chronic poverty and gives them a way that they have, skills that they own, to actually create their own cash income without support from outside. And this is tremendously empowering for people. And this is what we do. And pretty much our projects, wherever they are in different places, they follow this same recipe about always using what's there already, but helping people to do it in a more business-like way to escape from poverty. Now, this talk is really about research, and of course, every day, or at least every week, there seems to be some bit of new bee research, always interesting things about things that have been discovered about bees. There's always something new to learn about them. And if we look at the data, actually, during the last decade, the amount of papers on bee research more or less doubled. There's huge amounts of research going on nowadays, especially on honeybees. And on the left there, you can see the sort of topics that are involved. Most of the research that's going on is related to pollination, the health of bees, the effects of agrotoxins on bees, breeding of bees. Of course, these are very, very important topics, and we need to understand about nutrition of bees, and we need to understand the consequences of agrotoxins. But I would like to argue this afternoon that there's other research that still needs effort, still needs more effort. And these are the two areas that I would like to talk about. Bees. We really know so much less about the biology and behavior of tropical honeybees. Tropical honeybees in Africa, tropical honeybees in Asia, and stingless bees all around the tropics as well. These are bees that people utilize for livelihoods, but actually we know much less about them than for honeybees of temperate zone, that is European origin. And then the other thing about which we need more research is really understanding the economics of beekeeping for the poorest people, because this is no small thing. It's a very interesting thing, and our approaches to helping people escape from poverty by means of beekeeping are not always the best ways for them. So these are the things that I'm talking about this afternoon. Now, tropical honeybees have biology and behavior that is very different from honeybees that evolved in temperate zones. And by temperate zones, I mean temperate climate, like here in the UK. And if we're talking about European honeybees, Apis mellifera, of course, this is the same species as is found in the Middle East and Africa. And of course, the climate conditions in the Middle East and tropical Africa are phenomenally different to the climate here in Europe. So our bees have evolved to fit the climate here, and the same species, but tropical bees, have evolved to fit tropical climates, and their biology and behavior is markedly different in some ways, and this affects the kind of beekeeping that you can do with tropical bees. In Asia, there are tropical honeybees, and it's kind of the same story. The bees living in the tropics have different strategies to cope with a tropical environment to bees in temperate zones. Now, if we look at Africa, migration is a very common thing to survive in tropical region. The people have traditionally been nomadic and migrated. The birds migrate. We're very familiar with that because in this case the birds migrate this time of year, they're migrating north. So we have African birds here with us that then migrate south again at the end of the summer. We're accustomed to the idea that birds migrate. We are quite accustomed to the idea that mammals migrate in Africa, the great movement of wildebeest and so on. This is animals moving to reach different habitats in different seasons. And just with the humans and the birds and the mammals, bees migrate too in the tropics. And it's a difficult thing to study, of course, but they do. And they migrate according to what is in flower and dearth periods, moving from areas of drought to areas that have water and so on. But we really don't know a lot about this, although beekeepers will tell you that the bees migrate up and down this valley and so on. So tropical honeybees are far more mobile than our temperate dwelling honeybees, and they're mobile in three ways. The colony will swarm. Well, we understand that, what that means. Absconding means the whole colony will clear off. So if a colony is being pestered by ants, probably by next day the whole colony will have gone. And colonies migrate, as I just described, to take advantage of forage and of climate conditions. So the consequence of this is that in a tropical habitat, a beekeeper's hives will often be empty because the bees have absconded or migrated. You can tell the difference between absconding and migration because if bees abscond from a nest site, they will leave behind what they have to leave behind, like brood and stores, honey and pollen. But when they migrate, this is a planned movement and they will not leave anything behind. They'll leave empty combs behind. The brood will dwindle and there will be no pollen and honey left behind. They take what stores they have with them, what honey they have with them, really, because the brood has declined. And the consequence is the beekeeper has an empty hive. Now, if you've got a very expensive hive and it's empty, that really is going to be a poor return on investment. If you have a very low cost hive and it's empty, then it's not such a problem. And beekeepers in tropical Africa have evolved a beekeeping method that copes with this much greater mobility of tropical honeybee colonies. So here's some WBC hives with temperate European honeybees living inside. Here in the UK, we have a long winter dearth period, and there's no way that our bees could take the risk of absconding or migrating. If something goes wrong for them in August, they've had no chance of rebuilding a nest and rebuilding their stores to survive the winter. So temperate honeybees are far more likely to kind of batten down the hatches and plan always to be staying in the hive they live in. Of course, from time to time, our bees do abscond, but in a lifetime of beekeeping, the beekeeper will see that maybe a few times, but it's quite rare. Pretty much honeybees that evolved in a temperate climate want to stay inside their cavity, inside their hive. And the only time they're really mobile is when the colony is swarming. So because our bees tend to stay in the hive, we can invest a great deal of money and time and effort in that hive because we know the bees are going to stay there. So frame hives are kind of complicated piece of furniture. They've become quite, yes, complicated furniture, let's describe them that way. And the beekeeper invests a lot of time in managing the colony in the way that the beekeeper wants to intervene. And according to what the beekeeper wants to achieve, whether these are bees for maximum honey production or maybe for pollination purpose, or maybe more nowadays for the interest of the beekeeper having bees to enjoy their company, as it were, the beekeeper can manage the bees in that hive and know that they're going to stay there and they're in looking after those bees will be rewarded. But when we come to tropical bees, it's different because the bees are much more mobile. Now, if you've ever been in tropical Africa, this is a typical roadside scene, a tree with hives in it, put there by the beekeeper. And typically, a tropical African beekeeper will have 100 or 200 hives like this. And in this case, there's quite a few hives in that tree. Probably the beekeeper has put them there to catch passing colonies, and the beekeeper, once they're occupied, may take those hives down and move them somewhere else. That's quite likely, and beekeepers often know the kind of bee highways where colonies regularly pass through, and they know where to situate those hives. Well, this is a kind of beekeeping that we don't know anything about here in the UK. Our bees don't behave that way, so we don't do beekeeping this way. So we call this extensive beekeeping, and the beekeeper has a very good strategy for dealing with the mobility of the bees by having a large number of low-cost hives, and this accommodates the much greater mobility of a tropical African honeybee colony. So the beekeeper, the strategy is to have a large number of very cheap hives. Don't put a lot of capital, effort or investment in each one, because at any one time, maybe only half of them, or less than that, maybe only a third of them will be occupied by bees, although probably all of them will be occupied by bees at some time. But a hive will never remain full of bees for a long period. So here's a nice tropical African forest, and actually that forest is full of nice tropical African bees and tropical African beekeeping as well. That forest is full of beehives, and they look like this. This is in southwest Ethiopia. These are log hives and covered with spathes from conifers, I think. I'm not sure what they used in this case, but to wrap the hives to protect them from rain, and tied with forest vine. So these hives cost the beekeeper nothing. These are what we want, low-cost hives. And the beekeepers walk in that forest and carry the hives so that the hives are completely dispersed throughout the forest, so that the nectar and pollen in the flowers of those trees, beekeepers are making sure that the bees are using that resource, and the bees are throughout the forest, and the beekeepers' hives are throughout the forest. And actually, looked at this way, this is a fantastic example of good resource use. The beekeepers are getting maximum benefit from the nectar and pollen of the flowers in that forest. And actually nowadays, the honey and beeswax that you can produce from these clean areas is absolutely clean from residues of agrotoxins. And so the honey and beeswax are residue free, and they find good markets. And so young people are taking up this beekeeping. And as I said, very much the beekeepers are guardians of these forests. There's nothing else that you can do in these forests that is so benign. There's no extractive aspect to beekeeping. It's just win-win, because the bees are there and they are pollinating and maintaining the biodiversity of this forest, and the beekeepers are able, season after season, to create income. Very, very resilient, wonderful livelihood. The bees are healthy, very healthy, because they're local bees, they're living naturally, they have fantastic genetic integrity, they're widely spaced throughout the forest, and because they're nesting naturally and swarming naturally, this maintains their genetic integrity. And now, we understand more about swarming. It's part of the self-cleaning behavior of a honeybee colony. the bees are not interfered with by the beekeeper, really. The beekeeper situates the hive, and then the only thing that happens is the beekeeper comes and harvests the honeycomb from the other end of the hive to the entrance. So the brood nest is not damaged. The beekeepers love their bees just like we love our bees. They don't damage the brood nest. They take the honeycombs. So really it's minimal stress for the bees. The beekeepers are not in any way spreading diseases or, any kind of manipulations of the colonies. So we can say really it's genes and natural selection that protects this honeybee population. There's no treatments of these bees at all. We know that Varroa is there and normal honeybee pathogens are in all these places, but the bees survive well because they're allowed to evolve and adapt naturally. And we know that honeybees have fantastic, when they're able to, they have fantastic genetic diversity. That is the way that enables them to adapt according to pathogens. And here at Beast Development, we get very upset when there are so many efforts still to tell that this so-called traditional beekeeping would be improved by people changing technology to frame hives. And in Africa, people call frame hives modern hives, although, as we know, they were invented long ago in the 19th century, if not before. There's nothing really modern about them. But many, many projects endeavour to tell beekeepers they must change from that so-called traditional way to so-called modern way. And we know that these frame hives do not work well with tropical African bees because much of the time these frame hives will be empty because, as I have said already, bees migrate, bees abscond, and when you try to practice beekeeping management, or in the bees' terms, interference with bees in frame hives, they very frequently abscond the next day. You find that you go back and find the hive empty. These hives do not work well for tropical African bees, but it's for various reasons. That's a message that people don't want to hear. And people have knowledge of frame hive beekeeping, but it's meaningless without understanding really the bees and the consequences for the beekeeping and the beekeepers. So this is actually very good beekeeping if you really understand and know what's going on here. There's nothing backward or undesirable about this beekeeping. It's simple, it's low cost, it's cost effective, it enables fantastic resource use of these African forests. It's very, very good beekeeping. It's modern, it's ecological, it's economic. What's not to like? So now I want to move on from talking about the bees to actually talking a bit more about people. Let's look at beekeepers. We have full-time beekeepers, we have part-time beekeepers, and we have hobby beekeepers. I think all of us as beekeepers, we must fit into one of these three categories. If we first of all look at a full-time beekeeper, here in the UK, we tend to call them commercial beekeepers. Some places they're called professional beekeepers. A commercial beekeeper will be characterized by putting full-time effort into the role. They will probably need capital investment to enable them to scale up and work on a large scale, and maybe need access to credit. And the enterprise absolutely must be profit-making. If we look at a part-time beekeeper, sometimes called a backyard beekeeper or an amateur beekeeper, although maybe that's the wrong term. A part-time beekeeper, they will be characterized by having beekeeping as one of a number of income sources, but still the beekeeping must be profit making. Maybe the beekeeper has half a dozen or more different ways of creating a livelihood, but together they must add up to a livelihood, and the beekeeping is one of them. And this is a kind of safe way to build a livelihood. You don't put all your eggs in one basket, you rely on a number of income sources. And this is mainly how poor people live, by having quite a range of things. If one goes wrong, they've got something else to rely on. And this is where beekeeping fits in for so many of the poorest people. Then we have hobby beekeepers, and here in the UK, most of our beekeepers, we would say, are hobby beekeepers, and they will do beekeeping in their spare time. It's a hobby. Sometimes they're called backyard beekeepers or amateur beekeepers, but that's maybe a bit of a wrong term, because many of these hobby beekeepers are great experts. They know an awful lot about bees and beekeeping, but still they might be doing beekeeping not primarily to make a profit, or maybe not at all to make a profit. It's their spare time, highly enjoyable activity. They have other goals than profit, maybe to win at the National Honey Show. And maybe if you count up the hours that go into the beekeeping and the money that is spent on equipment, there's absolutely no profit. In fact, it may be a cost, but an enjoyable cost. And of course, many of us during the past year have found great solace and comfort and interest from our bees, which is more than money, actually. So there are other reasons to do beekeeping. But if we're talking about the poorest people in the world, they are not hobby beekeepers. They're not doing beekeeping for fun by any means. They're doing beekeeping as part of their livelihood, and there has to be a return on investment. It will be one of several income sources. It has to be no capital or low capital investment required. It has to be profit making at the end of the day, and it should be low risk, because if you're poor, you can't take on a risky venture. It has to be something safe. And this is where beekeeping fits in so well to building a resilient rural livelihood. So just to think a bit more about the economics of beekeeping for poorest people, these are beekeepers in Asia, but this afternoon I'm really focusing on beekeepers more in Africa. Still today, most of the world's poorest people live in rural areas. 80% of farmland in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa is still managed by smallholders, and in Africa there's about 41 million of those smallholders, and many of these people are beekeepers. We think it's safe to say there are at least 1 million smallholder beekeepers in sub-Saharan Africa. And all of them are, as I described already, they want a resilient livelihood without risk, without debt, and that very much affects people's choice of technology. So here's a group of rural people. These people are in Rwanda. And, you know, how much do you or I know about how people like this make decisions and build a livelihood? It's a tough life, and you can't afford to waste your time doing something that isn't going to be a return on investment. So this is from a long time ago, really, written in the 1930s, but somebody in Zambia explaining the same thing, talking about the same thing. The success of a scheme has to be securing for the producer some good output for their extra trouble. Success depends on the labour required, what capital inputs might be required, and the return on investment. And this is absolutely stands true today. This is a poor person will decide if they want to do beekeeping, depending on the amount of effort needed, how much it will cost, and how much they stand to gain from the beekeeping. So these are the kind of things we have to think about if you're planning to work with people like this. You have to understand their situation. So a little bit of history, if we look at Africa. During the 19th century and before that, there were many tons of beeswax being exported from Africa, from Mombasa, from Angola, from Dar es Salaam. Beeswax was a big trade in exporting beeswax, which has continued to today. Beeswax is still exported from Africa, but all the time, colonial people were arriving and telling, maybe you should be using frame hives. And for more than 100 years, this has been going on. Even though, as I say, plenty of beeswax was already being exported, so something was being done well already. In the 60s and 70s and 80s, Francis Smith wrote a lot of good information about tropical African beekeeping, and then Bernard Klaus in Zambia wrote, again, a lot of detailed and good information about tropical honeybees and tropical beekeeping. We haven't seen so much really good stuff written in recent years. I think this was because people like Smith and Klaus, they were really living there and had time to devote to doing this kind of work and publishing it. During the 1970s and 1980s, John Corner was a Canadian person, but lots of Canadian effort went into East Africa, shipping equipment for making frame hives. Much of that equipment is still there, some of it is still working. But the frame hives have never caught on with tropical African bees. I'm very pleased that in recent years there's been much greater recognition of the value of beekeeping within people's livelihoods. There have been some very excellent beekeeping development programs, but there have been many unsuccessful ones too. Efforts always to change technology to tell tropical African beekeepers they should be using modern frame hives. And now we see so many things, so many donor agencies talking about beekeeping, all sorts of bee efforts going on, which is a good thing in many ways. All the big donors are talking about bees, talking up beekeeping, which is good. But then also I go to these big meetings where people complain. The problem is that our beekeeping projects have not delivered results. And the reason is because these projects are again and again trying to change technology from local methods of beekeeping with tropical African bees to changing technology to use of frame hives, which do not work well in tropical Africa. And there's very little research being done on this, and very poor research. It's not the correct comparison to compare one frame hive with one local style hive, because that isn't the right comparison. A beekeeper will never just have one local style hive. The beekeeper will have 50 or 100 or 200 or 300. It doesn't work just with one. You have to have a good number of them because the bees are mobile, but because they cost nothing, you can have many hives. But again and again, we see this comparing one frame hive with one box hive. And we see lots of wording like this. Uganda currently harvests only 1% of a potential 500,000 tons of honey per year. We see this piece of data quoted again and again. Somebody wrote it and then subsequent authors repeat it. But what does it mean? What does it mean? A potential of 500,000 tons of honey a year. We don't talk about honey potential for other countries. As I said already, we think African beekeepers are doing remarkably efficient resource use by scattering beehives all over the available resources. What possible data is there to say that Uganda's harvesting only 1% of the potential? We find when research like this is published, well, I'll go on. And again, we see it all the time, talking about this potential. This is talking about Kenya saying the potential for honey and beeswax is huge, but has remained unexploited. Production is less than 10% of its potential. Where's the data that supports this? Where is it? We haven't seen it. And these so-called facts get repeated and repeated, but where is the data? A lack of both training in bee husbandry and protective equipment. I mean, bee husbandry and protective equipment do not increase of themselves productivity. We see it again and again. Unrealistic and exaggerated expectations, poor situation analysis, wrong approaches, insufficient data, few baseline studies, and many projects that are unsuccessful but are not evaluated. So when things don't work, it's not recorded. When things work well, of course, that is recorded. But all these projects of introducing frame hives, please, let's see some evaluations, let's see your data, let's see your success, because we have not seen any of it. The terminology and vocabulary is nonsense, non-scientific, talking always about traditional hives as if they're somehow backward, and modern hives that were invented in the 19th century. This is the voice of a beekeeper in Zambia who was laughing about the number of donor agencies who have come and told him he should change from his bark hives that work very well to so-called modern frame hives. This is what he said. Do you honestly expect me to spend my hard-earned money on timber beehives? He means on buying frame hives. This is the only time of the year I get to buy clothes for myself and my children, clothes I dream about buying for the whole year. No, that's not going to happen. He's saying the money he gets from his beekeeping, from his bark hives, he uses it. It's the most important money he gets to buy clothes for him and his family. He's not going to use that money to buy timber beehives. He does not need them. And here's a picture I took in Tanzania of the extension officer recording success of the hives that these people have been donated by a project, a frame hive. But look at the house the people are living in. You know, the carpentry of the frame hives is much more beautiful than the people's own home. And those nice boxes are destined to be used as chairs and tables, I promise you. So just to summarize, when it comes to beekeeping development, the two areas we would like to see research done is more understanding of the biology and behavior of tropical honeybee colonies, and more understanding of the economics of beekeeping for the poorest people. And so the outcomes of this lack of understanding is because we lack appreciation of the mobility of tropical honeybees. This means again and again projects advise inappropriate technology. And by this I mean so-called modern hives, frame hives, where they really don't work well. Because we lack understanding of the economics of beekeeping as practiced by very poor people and the choices they have to make to build resilient livelihoods, the outcome from this is also that projects advise inappropriate technology. So these are the drivers that continue forcing these projects that really don't work well. And that was what I wanted to talk about this afternoon. Thank you for your interest. If you'd like to know more about our work, please have a look at our website, or if you're based in the UK, you're very welcome to come and visit us when allowed to do so in Monmouth. Thank you very much. Do have a look at our website if you want to know more. And now I will try to answer your questions.
Thank you, Nicola. That was splendid information about the work that you're doing that's so vital in some of these areas and countries. So let's get on to the first question. It says, how do these log frames used in Africa tropics translate to beekeeping in Asia? I think it might mean log hives.
Yeah. Okay. No, log hives, as you saw in my talk in Africa, they're used all around the developing world. So you can see the same hives being used in Asia, containing Apis cerana honeybees. You can see them being used in Central America, containing stingless bees, and of course containing stingless bees in Africa and in Asia as well. So a hollow cylinder, whether it's a hollow log or a bamboo basket or a hive like this one behind me here, the horizontal cylinder is kind of a very simple, ubiquitous beehive found all around the world, and with different species of bees being kept inside. And they normally work, different places, people do it in different ways, but normally the entrance is at one narrow end and the other end is removable. So the beekeeper will go to the other end and smoke from the other end so that bees go out of the entrance. And almost always the brood nest is nearest the entrance and the honeycombs are away from the entrance. So when you take the back of the hive off, you're kind of automatically close to the honeycombs that you want to harvest. And that's how they're used.
What do you think, Nicola, are the main things that we might learn from actual traditional beekeepers? What they do and how it perhaps compares with what we do, but what should we be able to learn from what they're doing?
Yes, so much. I mean, here at Bees for Development, we never use the word traditional because it implies something of the past and something behind, as opposed to modern, that somehow traditional is not as good as modern. But there are beekeepers doing beekeeping today with these techniques, and they work very well. They're very simple techniques, and we've got so much to learn, actually. In other kinds of agriculture, people seem to go and understand local techniques and put great value on them. But in the beekeeping world, we haven't been so good at that. We haven't been going and really listening to beekeepers and understanding why they're doing it the way they're doing it. And what amazes me is that when you work with beekeepers in different places around the world, they're actually doing beekeeping in very different ways, because the bees they're working with are very different, and they've figured out exactly the right techniques to use with those bees. So, you know, if we suddenly had tropical African bees here in the UK, you would not be able to manage them in national hives as we do, because as soon as you disturb them, tropical bees abscond because they can afford to abscond. So you cannot do many of the things that you can do with a honeybee colony in a temperate zone, where the bees more or less always have to stay put in the hive. If they can afford to abscond and you go and interfere with them, they will abscond by next morning. So beekeepers are like the bees, actually. They have evolved the very best ways of managing those bees. They know how to do it. So there's an awful lot to learn from them. But what you'll learn from them is about how to look after those bees, not necessarily your bees at home. If I can put it that way.
Oh, thank you. So In the work that you're doing, you obviously are reliant on donations and getting support for your work to be able to do it. What's the best way that we can actually help Bees for Development in financially?
Oh, thank you for that question. We are dependent on donations, and luckily for us, beekeepers are very generous. We get fabulous support from British beekeepers and beekeeping associations. It's amazing what beekeepers are doing all over the place. It's quite hard during COVID to have the usual fundraisers, but beekeepers are imaginative. And we've got a new campaign this year, which is called Our Bees Give Back, which means that beekeepers are giving back something from their actual honey sales. So that's our new campaign, Our Bees Give Back. And then actually when you're selling your honey, it's nice that you can tell the person buying it that they're not just buying your honey, but they're supporting beekeepers far away as well.
Well, thank you. And presumably there's quite a lot of activities that go on that aren't necessarily connected with beekeeping. I'm thinking that we're nearly out of lockdown. We're hoping to get out, but things like doing a run or a swim or taking on some activity. Do you sort of find a lot of people supporting you like that?
Yes, we've had lots of things. We had here in Monmouth when they had their Santa Fun Run, not last year, the year before. Instead of a Santa Fun Run, it was a Bee Fun Run.
Oh, brilliant.
So they raised money for us that way. So.
Oh, that sounds great. Thank you. Well, let's ask another question that's come in here is how would the results of research into the mobility of tropical bees influence the work of Bees for Development? It's a little bit similar to a previous question, but maybe more precise.
Yes, that's a good question. It wouldn't really affect our work because we kind of understand that bees are mobile, and that's one of the reasons why we really encourage extensive beekeeping, where the beekeeper has a large number of low-cost hives. But many people who are promoting frame hives in tropical regions don't understand that tropical bees are mobile and migrate, but there's really no published research on that. And I think it would help people to understand why hives are often empty in tropical areas, because those bees are migrating. And it's a behaviour that we're so not familiar with here in the UK. Our bees don't migrate, but tropical bees do migrate. And that's why you should not spend a lot of money on expensive beehives, because a proportion of them at any time will be empty because those bees are so mobile. Colonies are mobile.
Right. Just one other point. You work in areas, I noticed in your presentation, a lot of trees around, a lot of forested areas. Do you have to be quite selective in choosing the areas where you work?
No, actually, if we look at Ethiopia, the forested areas, mainly in southwest Ethiopia, there's lots of beekeeping there, but the beekeepers are actually doing very well. They're quite well off. They don't need us at all to work with them. And we actually work in the north of Ethiopia, where it's deforested, terribly arid, destroyed habitat. And so the beekeeping that we promote there is all with top bar hives and making low-cost hives from bamboo and things like that. So very simple, low-cost beekeeping, but we're not able to promote forest beekeeping because there's no forest left. We are restoring that forest, yes, but people have to do top bar hive beekeeping.
I've got a question here about somebody who's been reading the Beekeeping Quarterly, and it's the widespread adulteration of honey is beginning to impact on small-scale beekeepers in India. To what extent are your beekeepers abroad being affected by the increased adulteration, bringing the price of the honey down and making their product too expensive for the markets?
Gosh, there's not in that question. In some of the places that we work, especially where they're using top bar hives or log hives, actually the beekeepers sell the honey in the comb, and they have no problem selling it at all. So they sell honeycomb, and it's the same here in the UK. Actually, it's the easiest way to sell honey. You don't have to process it, and the consumer absolutely knows it's honeycomb. And ironically, it's least work for the beekeeper, but you get premium price for the honeycomb product. It's the best product. But if you're going to increase volumes of honey, then beekeepers do need to sell into distant markets. And the longer the market chain, the greater the requirement to prove the provenance of the honey. And traceability of honey is increasingly coming in, and the necessity to prove that this product has come from this beekeeper. And that's a problem for all of us, not just beekeepers in developing countries.
The question here is great. Thank you, Julia. Great lecture. What subspecies of the tropical African bees, what subspecies are there? And can you recommend any books on these bees in terms of biology rather than beekeeping? Thank goodness they said that bit at the end.
Gosh, well, there's many races of Apis mellifera in Africa, a great many races. The first person to publish work about it was Friedrich Rutner, who began with morphometry of the African bees, but nowadays, of course, there's genetic analysis of those bees as well. There's not much published. I will have to say Bees for Development Journal is a great source of information on African beekeeping, but no, there's no really one good book on African bees that I can recommend that's current, apart from Rutner's book, The Biogeography of Honeybees, which was published, I guess, in the 1990s in English.
So how much input does BFD support? How much input do they make to projects that are not being as successful as you would possibly expect them to be? If they're struggling slightly, do you have other support you can give them?
Well, when we have a project going on, we have continuous monitoring of that project. And nowadays you have, monitoring and evaluation systems, so that if things are slightly going awry, there's continuous adjustment of the work that's going on. So in the end, all of our projects do achieve their goals because you've been on top of it during the course of the project, as it were. But things happen. I mean, where we work in the north of Ethiopia, there's civil unrest in the next door region in Tigray. So it means refugees are moving into the area where we work. So more people want training. COVID has had a huge effect that we didn't really expect, which is that people have moved from urban areas where employment has gone down to rural areas, and they've wanted to go back to their roots, and then they need an income source. So we're experiencing a huge surge in increased demand for beekeeping training. And a bit the same as here. I mean, there's been a resurgence of interest in beekeeping here during COVID, and it's the same with the poor people where we work. COVID's just another damn thing that they have to deal with. And beekeeping is, as we know, a great way to quite quickly generate some income. So there's great increased demand for our services.
So what area would you actually say that the Bees for Development actually mainly use their funds, and what area does it mainly go into support?
The greatest part of our money at the moment is spent in Africa, but primarily in Ethiopia, in Uganda, where we work with disabled people now, and in Ghana. We're just starting some new work in a place called Donkokram, and it's near Lake Volta. There's lots of young men actually who are unemployed, and they're not well educated, and beekeeping is quite a good potential source of income for them.
I've got quite a nice comment here. It's not actually a question, it's a comment. It's many a year since I heard a sensible, intelligent lecture about beekeeping. I've been so impressed by Nicola's lecture, and thank the BBKA for having Nicola to give this presentation. And I think that the information that you've given us here has been remarkable, and the way in which you've been able to just easily answer all the questions about what you're doing. I can't wait to go to Monmouth and actually call in and visit you. And thank you so much for what you've been doing. I'm afraid we're out of time now for questions, but thank you for a very thought-provoking presentation, and thank you again to the CB Dennis Trust for the sponsorship. And of course, thank you to everybody who's been watching, and I hope they'll think very seriously about supporting you. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.